Welcome to the Black Entrepreneur Experience podcast, inside the business, buzz, and brilliance of Black entrepreneurs. Here is your host, Dr. Frances Richards.
What happens in Vegas goes all over the world on Black Entrepreneur Experience episode number 483. Thank you for joining us as we elevate the Black Entrepreneur Experience by interviewing CEOs, thought leaders, innovative thinkers, and Black entrepreneurs across the globe. I'm your host, Dr. Frances Richards. What do you do if you are impacted by mass incarceration and you have multiple loved ones pipelined to prison? Let's ask Tanay Tatum Edwards, founder and CEO of FreeCap Financial, Inc. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I've given our audience such a brief bio, Tanay. Why don't you fill in the gaps and share with our audience what you'd like them to know about you and your company?
I am the founder and CEO of a financial information company called FreeCap Financial, and we look at ways that investors can invest their assets in a more socially responsible way. Our flagship data set looks at the criminal justice space, as you mentioned, and how companies are impacting mass incarceration, whether they're leaders in fair chance hiring and hiring people when they come home from prison, how they manage prison labor in their supply chains, as well as how much money they make from vending contracts with prisons. We gather all this information on these companies and put it through our proprietary scorecard, which we then sell to asset managers and wealth managers so that they can make sure that our investments are not profiting off of companies that are extracting wealth from our communities. I grew up in this small town in rural Florida where some of the smartest people I know were pipelined to prison instead of college, including my little brother. And it wasn't until I went off to Vassar and got to study under some of the leading minds thinking about the prison industrial complex that I learned that there was this whole network of companies that had a direct financial incentive to keep people behind bars. And fast forward a few years past then, I started working in the asset management space doing impact measurement as well as investor relations for a fund here in the DC area, and saw that there was clearly a way that we could measure this and change the way capital was being used to help reduce mass incarceration in the U.S. But I didn't see folks in my industry thinking about that problem or solving that problem. And around that same time, my brother came home from a 4-year sentence, and we just talked about all the ways that companies made it really expensive for us to be in touch with each other, the unpaid labor he did while he was incarcerated, and how difficult it was for him to get a job when he came home, even though he had already served his time. And so given my experience in the finance space and doing impact measurement for investors, it was a problem that I couldn't unsee. I literally quit my job to go do research to figure out how do we start to measure this and change the way capital is allocated and build a business model around it.
You said something today that's interesting. Talk about that impact after they leave prison. Are companies still being financially rewarded, and how?
Two things. On the financial reward piece, a good example of this is the private prison companies in particular. If you remember during the Trump administration, they had a families belong together, a separation of families policy at the border. And part of that is driven by the fact that private prisons actually make more money by having more people in beds. And so if you separate the kids from their parents, you actually multiply the number of people you can charge the federal government for those seats. And so when you think about that one policy and what that looks like at scale of all these companies that have incentives from phone calls to the canteen, right? Like they have incentives to make sure people are behind bars so that they can increase their revenue model. And then when folks come home, discrimination happens at the employment process. In our data, we look at large companies. So of the largest 100 companies in the U.S., only a third of them actually say they do fair chance hiring, which means that they're willing to allow someone that has a arrest record to apply to that job and be considered for the job, which means the vast majority of companies are screening out people before they've even gotten to see whether or not that person is a fit for the job function. And we know that employment is one of the key ways to reduce recidivism and increases the likelihood of someone staying home afterwards. So it's both bad for us as a society, not just those individuals. And it's costing, our research shows that it's actually costing companies money to not be hiring these folks because there's such a labor shortage in the U.S. There's the most recent numbers that there's 3 million jobs that need to be filled, and we can't find people to fill them at the moment. And so companies who are able to tap into just as involved and just as impacted workers are actually have a competitive edge because they're increasing the talent pipeline of folks that they can hire from. So I can dig into more of that if that's of interest. But yeah, I would say most of the profiting happens while people are in prison. But the fact that companies deny folks jobs when they come back increases the likelihood of those people going back to prison.
What is something we as individuals listening, what is something we don't know about the prison industry that we should know?
It is extracting wealth from our communities. And so it's not just a so I think the statistic is 1 in 2 Americans have a family member who has spent time in jail or prison. A lot of people who end up in prison are breadwinners in their families. And it becomes, and so not only are you losing wealth from that person no longer to being able to contribute financially to the family, but it is also costing that family money to be able to stay in communication with those folks, to be able to pay for the legal fees associated with that. When you think about how disproportionately, like, the Black community is impacted by mass incarceration, for us to build wealth, we have to stop the forces that are extracting wealth from our communities, and mass incarceration is one of them.
There are so many brands and businesses that are dominating. Talk about a brand or a business that you admire and why.
This is going to be a little controversial, but we recently launched a decarceration index, which ranks the companies who are doing the best at hiring folks when they come home from prison while reducing their exposure to the prison industrial complex. In 2020, Walmart was called out for having a history of prison labor in their supply chain. And we have been gathering data on Walmart since 2019. Our most recent data that we gathered shows that they're actually leading in Bear Chance hiring because they've created these programs to intentionally recruit people who are formerly incarcerated into jobs that can lead to management positions. To me, like, that company is a leader because they were called out for doing something wrong, and they're putting together a solution to make things better, and they're willing to change their behavior. I think we take for granted. I think sometimes with call-out culture, we don't allow people to change their behavior to then become allies. And so I do think when people do that, that's actually incredibly brave. That's one of the companies that I look at in our data set that I'm really excited about.
Yes, that is huge. I want you to have a monologue, and I want you to name this person, living or not, and they've inspired you so much. Who is that person, and what are you saying to that person, Tanay?
I am a mix of my mother and my grandmother. My mom is an entrepreneur. She is a bartender, and people have always tried to figure out how she makes 6 figures as a bartender. And it's because she treats her clients like a book of business. And people come back to see her over and over again because she's not treating them. It's not a transactional relationship. And I learned so much about managing a book of business from her. And my mom then went on to leverage that into a bar catering business and into her own, like, paint studio. They're having that example as a young Black woman growing up in my own household of how you can be in control of your own wealth and wealth creation was incredibly important to me. And I would not be building this company if it wasn't for her. The other person is my grandmother. She was president of Generations Credit Union in North Carolina when I was a kid. And I remember when I would visit her, like, we would be on the road traveling to see all of her branches. And I didn't know at the time what big of a deal it was to have a Black woman her age, a boomer, who is leading a bank, but not just any bank, a bank that was committed to social impact and trying to get loans into the Black community and focusing on wealth creation for our folks. I think back to those experiences in those summers a lot, and how I didn't know that I was going to be a social justice investor. But between the entrepreneurship of my mom and watching my grandmother leverage finance to be able to create change in our communities, that so much has shaped who I am and the way that I approach change in building my own company. Kudos to the Black women in my life.
And say their names.
My grandmother is Maureen Beavers, and my mother is April Sykes.
Thank you for that. When you talk about quitting your job, your day quit, talk about that story behind that.
I don't know if you've ever had a session before, but the idea of figuring out solving this problem was keeping me up at night. Like, I was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, taking notes, reading everything that I could around incarceration, around impact measurement, around investing. And I remember I applied to this fellowship called Echoing Green. And it's a fellowship that invests in early stage entrepreneurs. Van Jones, Michelle Obama are two of the folks who were able to build their first organizations through this fellowship. And I made it to the next round. And I thought, okay, if these people think it's good enough where I can make it past the first round, then I might be onto something. And that was enough of a confidence boost for me to quit my job. But I also realized that it was hard for me to go to work every day because I was obsessed with building this company and the idea of what it could be. And it was getting in the way of my full-time job. So that's one of the reasons why I left at the time that I did. Thankfully, I ended up winning the fellowship a few months later, which provided some seed capital for us to get started. But yeah, it was just like that one initial moment of validation was enough that I needed to move forward. And it was definitely, I don't know if I recommend quitting outright to folks. Now that I've seen other models doing it, I definitely believe you can build a side hustle while you're in your full-time job. I am thankfully like in a partnership that I had the financial flexibility to be able to do that. I had saved enough at that point where I knew that I'd be good for at least a certain amount of time. I wouldn't have made that decision if I didn't have the like financial flexibility to do it, to be honest.
And you talked about raising capital and the financial flexibility. Talk about that a little bit more, coming from the financial space. And a lot of Black businesses are undercapitalized. Give some strategies in reference to that too.
Yeah, the system is rigged against us. And I don't know if you're familiar with what's just happened with the Freedom Fund, but it's a group of Black women investors who were told that it was illegal to give money to Black women. Essentially, that's what it comes down to. And so the system is rigged against us. What has worked for me is a few things. I was able to apply to fellowship and receive in-kind support from folks to start building the business. For example, our first set of data was built in relationship with the Georgetown Pivot Program and a group of interns that I was able to get through Georgetown who were able to work for me for academic credit and do some of that initial research before we actually went out and built the technology. I had to be more scrappy than honestly what is necessary because of the lack of capital. But applying to fellowships based on like my experience in leadership also helped. I think something that I would have done differently is that I spent a lot of my early days at the company talking to investors to try to get funding for FreeCap. And what I wish I had done instead was spent that time talking to customers and getting cash flow for FreeCap, because cash is king. And when you have revenue, people can't say anything to you. So I do think that making sure you're working directly with the people that you're planning to serve, and depending on your industry, you might be able to get a future customer to pay in advance to build what you're trying to build for them, right? Like it doesn't necessarily, like you don't have to always have the product ready today if you know you can deliver on it. That's something that I would definitely recommend to folks. And then the last piece is choosing to bank with a CDFI, so a community development financial institution, and building a credit history with them so that if you do have a business that requires a loan or upfront capital investment, you have that track record in history with them. They have a mission to loan to folks like us. Those people are allies and want to get money into the Black community. And so I recommend working with them over trying to go through the big banks.
There's a lot of ebb and flows in businesses, starting a business, and it's a lot of risk. When we talk about risk, we're going to talk about it in terms of opportunity, and others know it as possibly worst moment in business. Talk about your opportunity or the worst moment in business, and what was your takeaway?
I did an incubator, and which is like, I'm sure some folks in your audience will know this, but it's a place where you go where you have an early stage idea and a bunch of different people provide feedback and you learn how to pitch. And it's very much geared towards you going to raise venture capital at the end of the process. I had, because I was building a financial data company, based on what I saw my peers who are all white raise in their first rounds, I said, okay, $1.5 million makes sense. This is how much money I need to actually bring this product to market. I had an elite investor come to me and say, hey, Tanay, this is awesome. We want to seed you around with $500,000. And they said, just find someone else to come into the round and we can start the due diligence process. And by the time I found someone else, they had changed their mind. Apparently, George Floyd had happened, and they wanted to find a different way to use that capital to think about racial equity. And I'm like, okay, so you're going to take funding away from the Black woman who's working on decarceration efforts in response to this. Okay. I went from thinking that I was going to have $1 million to having nothing. And I was building for that. And I remember having a mental breakdown, and I'm incredibly thankful for my partner. My husband called like a family friend, and we were able to like go to Vermont, basically in the middle of nowhere in a cabin that was off the grid. And I stayed there for 2 weeks, no internet, no TV, and just wrote and processed my feelings and hiked in nature. And I really needed that healing process. When I came back, that's when I decided to start to be more scrappy. I think I could have decided to give up. There are multiple times when I've thought about quitting, but because I took that space to think about what was going on, I came back and I hired a group of interns, and I said, okay, if they're not going to pay me, they're not going to give me the money to build the technology to grab this research, I'm going to do it manually, which means I need a lot of students to help me. I do think that because of that, today, my team and I are the sole owners of the company. If I had actually raised that capital based on where I was as a startup and how early stage we were, I probably would have had to give up like 40%, 50% of the business, which would look very different. And now I own most of my business because that happened. That was definitely a silver lining moment for me.
Let's talk about love, marriage, and managing a business.
Yeah, it's important. I remember talking to an entrepreneur who told me that he basically, multiple people told me they had to choose between their partners or their business. And I had an existential crisis when I first started thinking about what it was supposed to take to be able to be an entrepreneur, like whether or not I can have kids, whether or not I can like sustain my marriage. And I actually think having those pieces in my life grounds me to remind me that of what is most important. And my husband and my 2-year-old is what encourages me to get through this work. I have no idea why that advice circles through some of these entrepreneurship circles, but yeah, there are multiple times when I've been ready to give up, and my husband's the one who's like, no, you've worked too hard. We've worked too hard. He's like, you have too much sweat equity. Our family has too much sweat equity for you to stop at this point. So I'm incredibly grateful for that grounding. And I do think having a healthy relationship if you are in a relationship with a partner is important, and being intentional about keeping that healthy, and because it actually is a strength for your business, it's not taking away from your business.
Mental wellness and entrepreneurship. Talk about that.
It's tough. I mean, I think people when you think of an entrepreneur, you see someone who's like on the cover of Forbes or has like having articles written about them, have won these awards and and that's not what it is. There are a few glamour moments, but it's really difficult work. It's mostly no's, and if you're doing something that's innovative and new, it's a lot of people. If you're not talking to your customers, I will say, it's a lot of people looking at you like, okay, that's cool, and not taking you seriously. I do think that you have to be really intentional about your mental health. Something that has helped me is being around other entrepreneurs, particularly folks who are doing innovative work. Because what I'm doing in the finance space is still pretty radical for finance. I've been able to build a community of people within financial services who are also trying to change the way capital markets work. But I'm also very good friends with other entrepreneurs who are doing something, whether it's in law or medicine or whatever like field they're in, doing something that's very different. So we have conversations every month to remind ourselves like of how to like keep each other motivated and know that and to share learnings from each other, because so many of the challenges of starting a business upfront are the same. Like even though I'm in a different industry, like everyone has to hire their first employee. That's incredibly stressful. At some point, if you get big enough, everyone has to fire their first employee, which is also very stressful. And so being able to have sounding boards for that has been incredibly helpful and for my mental health, because I know that I'm not going to do this alone.
And talking about vetting employees, and also you have a partner with your business, even talk about that.
Yeah, something that I've been able to do, I know everyone can't do this, but folks I've worked with for all the folks who are full time now all started off as contractors. And so they were doing like 10 hours a week of work, and that work kept scaling. And then when we had enough capital to be able to bring them on board, we brought them on board as full time employees. And that de-risked the process of hiring for me a lot because I already knew the folks and had a working relationship with the people I was bringing on board full time. My first hire, I hired someone who was too junior for the role and ended up being me managing a lot as opposed to someone who could actually take things off my plate and run with it. And I would say that what was very different about the second person that I hired, that person was more senior. And even though it was an expensive investment, he was able to come in and say, okay, Tanay, like you're good at marketing, sales, communication, strategy. You just do that. All the operations, research, back office, I do that. And so when I took the parts off my plate that I wasn't as good at and gave it to someone else, our business started to grow faster because I was doing the parts of the business that I'm really good at. And he was doing the parts that he was really good at. That I really do think about hiring in that sense too, of like when you're building a company, who do you need that's going to allow you to do the parts of the business that you're best at so that you can grow? And who can you trust to run with it and not necessarily need you to be guiding the whole process? At least that's been my secret to thinking about how we scale. I mean, not my secret. That's just how I've worked. I'll let you know in a couple of years if it's working.
What is your zone of genius, Tanay?
I think probably communicating complex ideas to people. I work in a very data heavy space, but I'm able to like humanize the numbers and the research in a way that allows people to make that connection between things that the technical and emotional part of your brain. Yeah, a space where I'm able to communicate and particularly complex ideas in a way to bring people along on that journey is where I like to operate.
Talk about your top 2 mentors or influencers and what lessons did they teach you?
Oh, this is a tough one. I have a lot of great mentors in my community and I think of different stages of life. I'll start with high school, actually. My high school basketball coach, Ginger Forte, who has since passed away, I was not the best basketball player. I loved basketball. I loved it. And I worked so hard, but I was not the best. But it was so good for me to be in a place where I wasn't necessarily the best, but she was able to push me to be my best self so that I could be proud of what I was doing. And even though I was never going to be the star player, I knew every day I was showing up as my best self and that she was coaching that out of me. And that has helped me through life learn how to stay in my own lane and trying to think about my race as my individual race and not necessarily how other people are doing compared to me. I'm really grateful for Ginger Forte for that. And then I will say another person that comes to mind is Morgan Simon, who is one of the leaders in the impact investing space. He is in 2019 when I first quit my job and I was at this big industry conference trying to get meetings with people, to pitch to people. No one took me seriously. And she was the only person who's senior who took a meeting with me. And she gave me such genuine advice, even though her career this is all public information now, but she was being sued by the private prison companies at the time because of how successful her work at getting people to divest from them had been. And the fact that she had all this personal stress and was still willing to take time out to meet this young person who hadn't figured everything else out yet, but needed guidance was really incredible. And I've continued, and she has a book that I read about real impact and impact measurement, which has definitely shaped the way I think about how we measure impact in capital markets. I'm grateful for that relationship. I think she reminds me too that to not always, brilliance isn't always in someone's title. On my research team now, for example, we have someone who is 2 years Erica started working with me when she was a junior in college. She's now 2 years out of college and is leading our research process and is incredibly talented. And I think a lot of people think years of experience is what determines someone's brilliance. But Morgan taking that chance on me when I really didn't know what I was doing has allowed me to be able to expand my mind too when I'm thinking about folks who I'm mentoring and bringing up in the space.
Why finance? Why did you major in finance?
Honestly, finance happened to me. So I was studying at the International Relations School at Fletcher, And I thought I wanted to do conflict resolution work in the nonprofit space. Very, very different. I took a development course and realized that a lot of the issues that I saw at the nonprofit I was working at before around funders and the way the incentive structures around how so many of the programs you do so much depend on what people are willing to fund at that time, and nonprofits having to change their models to fit what funders wanted. I thought that was unique to the organization that I worked for. I went to grad school and found out my first class found out that it was not unique. It was the industry. And I said, well, I came to school to do this thing. I'm not going back to that. What is the exact opposite of this? And so I took a corporate finance class and I absolutely loved it. And what was great about being at an international relations school is that impact, like microfinance and impact, was one of the first forms of impact investing in terms of helping people get access to credit. And the folks in international development have been doing this for years. And so I was able to talk to people and learn from people who were leading in impact investing before it was called impact investing. I think being in that environment got me really excited because I found a way that you could still have social impact in the world, but the revenue model was responsive. You're responsive to your clients because the clients are the ones paying you for the impact, not funders. And that business model really excited me. And so I don't think I would not have found my way to finance if I wasn't able to do it through a social impact lens. But thankfully, being at that graduate program at the time I was there, I was able to do that.
And what's on the horizon for FreeCap within the next year, 2 years, 6 months?
Yeah, so we just launched our decarceration index, as I mentioned earlier, which looks at the large companies who are publicly traded in the U.S. and how well they do at hiring justice-involved people while reducing their prison exposure. We are looking for and talking to partners right now about turning this into a retail product so that it's easily accessible for people to invest in. Right now, our data essentially, like we sell it to asset managers, and right now, most of our clients, because of the client pool they serve, it's only available to like high net worth folks and people who are creating customized investment strategies that care about this. We want to turn this into a retail product so that anybody at any dollar amount can invest in decarceration. That's the big goal for us over the next year, is getting this decarceration product out.
Congratulations. Advice you wish you had followed?
Stay close to your customers. In the early days, I kept meeting with investors, and all the investors thought my idea was kind of radical and insane. And people who were in finance did not think it was crazy because they understood the risk that I was communicating. And I wish I had spent more time talking to those folks first, because I do think that I think I was too hard on myself in terms of what needed to exist before I could start selling a product. And if I had just been working with the customers directly more often, I would have been able to create the solution faster, and also be able to be validated and knowing that we're building in the right direction. I think sometimes, and this is partially because I came through the fellowship incubator universe to build my company, which is different than folks who bootstrap at the beginning. I was so focused on how do I communicate what I'm doing to investors as opposed to just like only talking to my customers and potential customers all the time. So I would just say, make sure you stay connected to those folks.
I like that. What book would you recommend and why?
I actually was just at a book talk recently by Andrea Longton, and she just published a book that explains how, as an individual, no matter how much money you have, you can make sure that your wealth is aligned with the values that you care about and is helping to have social impact. And the book is a step-by-step guide on how to do that. And it's really exciting because it's the first book I have come across that's a finance book on a how-to guide, but also thinking about it through a social impact lens. And she also has a lot of contributing authors, including myself, who are business owners who have started businesses focused on social justice investing. And so I do think that both as we're thinking about creating wealth, doing it in a way that's responsible so that the wealth that we create doesn't cause harm in our communities. But then also I think the stories in the book that she shares of consistently, whenever you go out on your own and build a business, it's an incredibly vulnerable process. Hearing these success stories of folks, their vulnerable moments, which to me was really, really exciting. I definitely recommend that book. It's called The Social Justice Investor.
And do you know where it's available at?
It's available online. I'm in DC, so I know Politics and Prose is a bookstore that is carrying it at the moment. like Amazon, Target, thrift books, wherever, like where you get your books from online. It should be easy to find.
Talk to a younger Tanay. What advice would you give to a younger you?
To remember that this is a marathon and not a sprint, and to run the race like a marathon because of the like social impact of the work. I think I sometimes came to it at the beginning like a martyr, like I needed to be down for the cause. And that was absolutely ridiculous. I'm allowed to live my life and be happy and be able to do good work in the world. Just remembering to run the race like a marathon and to pace myself, because it's what matters is that we're still here as a business and a company and influencing change, not necessarily how quickly it got done.
Tanay, if you conducted this interview, what is the one question you would have asked yourself? I'd like you to ask the question and answer it.
I guess we did talk about this a little bit, but like if you're starting a new business, what should you do? Like takeaways for key entrepreneurs. And I would say like the first is cash is king. So how quickly and how cheaply can you get to revenue for your company? That makes all other things possible in terms of fundraising and hiring staff, but thinking first of how do you get to revenue and always keeping that at the front of your mind. And you do that by staying close to your customers and listening to their needs. And then I would say also to be obsessed with the problem that you're solving, not the solution that you bring. Because if you're obsessed with the problem, then you're opening yourself up to the feedback of the people that you serve, and you can pivot accordingly to make sure that you're meeting their needs, which is how you grow your business. If you're obsessed with the solution, then you might build something that no one actually wants because you weren't listening to other folks.
We've come to the part of our interview. It's called Rapid Round of Fun. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'd like you to give me very quick answers. If there's something you desire not to answer, feel free to say pass. Are you ready for the Rapid Round of Fun?
Let's do it.
Your favorite comfort food?
Mac and cheese.
The last movie you watched?
Aristocats with my toddler because she's obsessed with animals right now.
You relax doing what?
Hiking.
Your favorite singer or rapper?
My favorite singer is Beyonce, rapper is J. Cole.
Your favorite dance song?
Probably Before I Let Go, both Frankie Beverly and the Beyonce version.
What food you eat every week, no matter what?
Oh, this is a boring response, but spinach. I always have a bucket of spinach, like a thing of spinach in the fridge because it's easy to drop into anything and add as a vegetable.
Work out or hit the couch?
The couch.
Tanay Tatum Edwards, thank you so much for joining us on Black Entrepreneur Experience Podcast. Before I let you go, share with our audience the best way for them to connect with you and to do business with you, to learn more about FreeCap and support what you're doing. And feel free to leave all your social media handles.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. You can follow us if you go to our website at freecapfinancial.com, you can find us on LinkedIn, where we're pretty active. You can join our newsletter on our website. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, are looking to gauge interest to see if folks would want access to a retail product to invest in incarceration. If you or folks in your community might be interested in this, if you could go to our website and fill out the little quick survey that we have expressing interest, that would be really helpful because I can take that and communicate to other folks too, the demand for the product as we launch it.
Thank you, Tanay. That's a wrap.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to Black Entrepreneur Experience. We would love for you to leave a review and rating on iTunes and share with your friends. For show notes and more episodes, go to www.beepodcast.com. Join us next Wednesday, and remember, green is the new black. So keep your bank accounts and your business in the black.